Paul McKeown, welcome to Over the Bonnet.
Thanks very much, Mark. It's lovely to be here.
Okay, you're into flying. You've been an airline pilot most of your life. How did it all start? Why did you get into aviation?
Well, I often ask myself the same question, but I was just afflicted with a lifelong fascination of aircraft and of flight. In fact, one of my earliest memories is asking, as a very small child, asking my mother, why does an aeroplane fly? How can an aeroplane fly? And I remember she answered, she said, well, they've got big engines that, pull them up into the sky. And that was kind of not a bad answer for me, but I wanted to know more. And I think, from as early as I can remember, I've just been fascinated by the whole concept of manned flight and aeroplanes and people going into the sky. So as soon as I was able, I suppose I turned that dream into a reality for myself.
How did that happen?
I originally, I think I had my focus on the Air Force. I fancied myself as a devil-may-care fighter pilot, and I thought that'll be the life for me. I'll fly some Mirage or F-18 fighter around the sky at Mach 2 and with my hair on fire. But it didn't kind of work out that way. So that was almost my dream.
Well, you're more of a Top Gun or a goose if you're going.
I think some would say that I'm more of a goose. That was my prime focus. I really wanted to join the Air Force, but unfortunately, my maturity curve didn't really match my ambition curve at that stage. And during school, I think I was more interested in reading a flying magazine up at the back of the class than paying attention to my studies. So I didn't do terribly well at school. I failed maths and physics at the first pass, and that was at that stage at least a very serious prerequisite for the Air Force. So
especially for flying.
Yeah, that's right. So I missed the boat with the Air Force. Later on, I went back and did maths and physics at night school, and it took me a lot of years. I got the prerequisites, but by that stage, life had moved on, and the Air Force never really worked for me. But I was lucky enough to start flying, at least in a small way, while I was still at school. So in year 11, I was at boarding school. My father used to pick me up on the weekends and take me out gliding to Boonah, and I'd do gliding out there. And some point during my second last year at school, I managed to go solo in a glider, and that was a pretty amazing experience.
Talk us through it.
Well, gliding's a funny sort of thing because you don't really get much structure in your training, at least you didn't in those days. So you turn up at the gliding club in the morning, and you might spend the whole day sort of dragging gliders around, and you might get a flight here and there. You never had the same instructor twice. I can't remember ever doing any theory. But I love the fact that when it did happen, I'd get in an aeroplane, we'd be towed up behind another aircraft, which is quite a noisy and dramatic experience in itself. But then there's that moment where you pull a cord on the side of the cockpit, and the tow rope gets released, and suddenly you're in silent flight. And it's just you and the elements, and you rely on your own skill and wits to stay in the air, basically using the thermal activity or maybe some ridge lift on the side of a mountain. And the better you are at it, the longer you stay up. But of course, when you're starting, you don't stay up very long at all. And if you've got to do any manoeuvres, you tend to create a lot of drag and come down sooner anyway. So it was sort of short flights and quite chaotic, really. And one day I was out there, and I'd done a couple of flights. I had done one particular flight with an instructor I'd never flown before in a glider I'd never flown before called a Bonnet. And it was I guess about a couple of hours before the end of the day. And I remember hearing a noise behind me, because in the glider you're sitting fore and aft, tandem configuration. The student or pilot sits in the front, the instructor sits in the back. And I could hear the clicking and clacking of his harness behind me, but it was a bit strange because he was actually standing beside me. Like, what's going on here? And then I had a pat on the shoulder and said, righto, I heard this, good luck, mate, and off you go. And he closed the canopy, and then suddenly I'm in the aeroplane by myself. And you've had the experience too, so you know what it's like. But it's a bewildering but magical thing, all happening at the same time. Sensory overload, really. But fortunately, they didn't give me enough time to think about it. So before I knew it, the tow rope was hooked on, the the Piper Pawnee tow plane had fired up its engine and I was off, and in a glider, the glider, when you're taking off, because it's got big wings and generates a lot of lift, it lifts off a lot earlier than the tow plane. And of course, without the instructor in the back, I was off even earlier. So it was quite startling that I, managed to hold it down and hold position behind the tug, and then off we went, and we climbed up to 2,000 feet and went through the procedure, and I, pulled the cord, and off I went into my beautiful silent flight. And I was on my own, and it's hard to explain the feeling, and it's something that most pilots will always remember. It's a very special sort of magical feeling, mixture of elation and terror all at the same time. The difference with a glider first solo, of course, is most aircraft, the instructor will get out and get you to do one circuit and land. That's the way it is for powered aircraft. But a glider, well, I didn't get any instructions and didn't tell me when to come back. There was a bit of thermal activity around, so I just flew on. So I flew round and round and got higher and higher, and I think I launched at 2,000 feet. I got up to about 4,500 or 5,000 feet, and from up there I could see everything around Boonah. I could almost see to Brisbane, and I could see the sun setting in the distance, and it was I was elated. And I think I was up for well over an hour. I think it was almost an hour and 20 minutes, which is a long first solo. And I was enjoying myself so much, I almost forgot that the sun was about to set and I probably ought to come home. So I finally sort of came to my senses and realised, oh heck, I better get back. So I pulled the air brake out and descended and came back and did a reasonable landing, and that's it, But that's the magical experience that every pilot sort of has in a different way sometimes. But the first solo is the first time you take responsibility for the aeroplane yourself, and it's a pretty awesome responsibility because you've got to manage to get yourself back on the ground in one piece.
But you don't get a chance when there's no power. You don't get a chance to go around. You've got one chance.
Well, that's right. That's the other unique thing about a glider, is every landing is a forced landing. So you certainly, you learn, if nothing else, how to judge your approach correctly and how to set yourself up on final so that you're going to land properly every time. You don't have an alternative. It was training that actually, has held me in good stead over the years, because when I got into powered aircraft, especially in the early days when I was flying ultralights, I had quite a number of engine failures, so situations where the engine failed and I had to land the aeroplane without power.
Really?
And of course, I was able to always fall back on my glider experience to achieve that. So it's, sounds quite dramatic, but for me, engine failures have never posed too much of a problem, and I always thank my glider training for that.
Well, I know a friend of mine that he had an engine failure. He was flying from Darwin back to south of Sydney, and he was coming towards Charleville, and he had a complete engine failure at about 6,000 or 7,000 feet, and he didn't have glider training, and there was a lot of pressure on him to actually put it on the ground, but he managed to. And as I've spoken to glider pilots saying, they get that every time.
Yeah, that's right. Of course, even powered aircraft receive that training as well. But having to do it in real life with the engine really stopped certainly concentrates the mind, that's for sure.
Well, training is an integral part of flying.
Yeah, well, that's right. And, to that end, the better a pilot is trained, the safer they will be generally. There's other factors as well. We talk about airmanship, so decision making and your approach, your professionalism to flying is very important as well. But that can be trained for as well. But there's a little bit of personal discipline and personal attitude that's involved there. But training for those things like emergencies, forced landing, stalling, spinning, unusual events, really important for a pilot to develop those skills so they can go out and pursue their craft safely.
Let's get back to that first solo that you had in the glider. What happened? You pulled the canopy off and then you got out. How did you feel?
Well, I think I was 16 years old then, so I think I was a bit too cool for school, so I was just kind of, whatever. But deep down, of course, I'd been dreaming about that moment for years and years and years, ever since I was a small boy, I had so many, I longed for it for so long. I used to ride my pushy out to the airfield long before I got anywhere near an aeroplane, just to sit at the fence watching aeroplanes fly around, and I always imagined myself in the aeroplane as the pilot, and imagined myself doing that, and even imagined my first solo over and over. So yeah, look, it was a very, very special moment, as it is for every pilot.
But the elation must have been immense. How proud was your father? Because he was taking you out there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he was. I'm sure he was very proud of me. Later on, he actually got his ultralight license as well, so we shared a few adventures down the track flying. But yeah, Dad was always a bit of an adventurer himself. He was a sailor more than a flyer originally, and a scuba diver and things. So he had that sort of adventurous streak. So yeah, I think we were able to share that moment together, which was very nice. Yeah.
You said that you failed in your bid to join the Air Force. What occupied you while you were waiting to become a pilot? How did you make ends meet?
Yeah, so I, devastated not being able to get into the Air Force, I was still determined to fly. So after I left school, I tried to, improve my flying qualifications and keep pursuing my flying as best I could. I didn't have a great deal of money at that stage, so gliding was great training, but also very cheap, because at that stage it was a club activity, so you don't pay for the instruction. So I managed to get my gliding qualification without too much expense, and then I was fortunate to stumble upon ultralights, and I just sort of hit an era where ultralights were just making some real progress in Australia. They developed two-seat ultralight aeroplanes, and they were moving from being a really scary sort of backyard kind of build your own thing.
Because they had a terrible reputation early on.
Yeah, they did, and there's a few reasons for that. But back to training, in those days they only had single-seat ultralights, oftentimes that people were making in their backyard. And there was no proper training, and so people taught themselves to fly, and that sometimes worked, but more often than not it didn't. So ultralights had a pretty bad reputation. But in 1984, the Australian government sort of regulated ultralights to a point. They brought in two-seat trainers, and an organisation called the Australian Ultralight Federation started. And they became a self-administering body that looked after the training and licensing of ultralight flying. They're still in existence now. They're the Recreational Aviation Australia, but at that point they just brought in two-seat aircraft. They were starting to become mainstream, and so I got some training in an ultralight and was able to move my glider qualifications to ultralight flying. I was able to do that fairly cheaply. I then went and started some powered flying at Archfield in general aviation aircraft. I went up to my private pilot licence, and then I ran completely out of money. At that stage I was working 2 night jobs in Brisbane and then flying in the day.
Welcome to aviation.
Yeah, that's right. The glamour of aviation. So one of my choice jobs at that period of time was I used to go at night with a little buddy of mine, and we used to clean 14 floors of the MLC building, but our job was cleaning the toilets and the bathrooms. And so he was another flying buddy of mine, but that's what we did. So 14 floors every night of the MLC building. The toilets was really something to behold after a busy day at the office. They were horrendous. But every bowl and every urinal and every basin was a few more dollars in my pocket to go flying. That sort of kept me going. But I got to the point where I really didn't know how I was going to, go through and get my commercial or go any further with it. But at about that point, I saw an ad in the paper for an ultralight instructor course, which was happening down at Coomera, opposite Dreamworld there. And at that stage, it was a very, very simple course, much different than it is now. I think it was a 10-hour course. It was bargained to take a week, and it cost $1,000. So I went cap in hand to my old mum, and I borrowed $1,000. I went and did this course and became an ultralight instructor. Still had really no idea what I was doing myself, but now I was in a position where I could teach people to do it. And it was a bit of a frightening prospect, really. But anyway, I was lucky enough to pick up a job at the same place, just a very casual job. And I remember my first day was in Drifters, and we had this tiny little strip at Coomera, just over from the Gold Coast.
Talk us through what a drifter is.
Well, a drifter is an open cockpit. We call it a rag and tube aeroplane. So it's got a metal frame. The wings are covered in Dacron like sailcloth, and it's got 2 fiberglass seats, one fore and aft, a bit like the glider, but it's completely open to the elements. The engine's on the back. It's got a little 2-stroke Rotax engine on the back. originally 50 horsepower, then they went to 65 horsepower. And you've got the front seat pilot has got a little pod around him, but not much else, and a stick and a rudder pedals and a throttle. But the wonderful thing about a drifter is when you're sitting in the front of the drifter, the wing and the rest of the aeroplane's all behind you. So when you go flying, it's like you're out there on your own, out the front, and flying like a bird. It's probably the closest you can get to being a bird and still have an engine and something resembling an aeroplane following along behind you. We had drifters there, and the school was run by a lovely old ex-airline captain called Barry Sigley, and he gave me a bit of a start there. And I remember my first day at work, I did a trial instructional flight, which was like a 15-minute flight with a student, and I was on the handsome wage of $15 an hour as a junior ultralight instructor on drifters. So I did my little flight. I think I might have gone a bit over the 0.3 of an hour or whatever it was, but that was all I did for the day. But at the end of the day, Captain Sigley paid me for my efforts, and he paid me cash. He's a cash man, old Barry. But he put the pay in my hand, and it was cash. It was $4.50 or something like that. But I just stood there and looked at it in the palm of my hand. I thought, my God, someone has just paid me to go and fly an aeroplane, and I thought that was the most amazing thing in the world. So I stayed there for a little while, and still working at night in Brisbane. Then I was fortunate enough to pick up a job over at Bonnet, where they were building the drifter, and they were at that stage selling a lot of aircraft out west to farmers, and they were getting really busy. So I started working at both flying schools during the day, alternate days of the week, and working at Brisbane at night. And gradually the Bonnet job got so busy, I left the Coomera job. I was able to give up one and then the other night jobs, and that became my full-time profession. And so I was an ultralight instructor there for about 5 years, and the money I earned there put me through my commercial and my instrument rating and my general aviation instructor rating, and so I've really got ultralights to thank for my career in aviation. I was able to get there in the end. But so
they hold a special a special place for you.
Yeah, they absolutely do, for those reasons, of course, but also because they're just so much fun, and I've always been attracted to the pureness of flight, just to get in the air and be in the element, not so much going from A to B, but just being in the air and being in charge of a craft that can move through the sky in 3 dimensions. And of course, something like a drifter gives you that experience like nothing else in the world. Yeah. So they've always had a place in my heart, and I've still got a drifter in my hangar, even after all these years.
So, okay, you've started to study, you're getting your commercial licence. Talk us through what happened then.
Well, look, when I was working at Bonnet, I had a lot of amazing experiences. I flew these little drifters all over the country. I flew them, across the Nullarbor to Perth, delivering them to customers. I went across, took one down to Tasmania, across Bass Strait, all through Western Queensland, New South Wales.
A drifter across the strait.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a bit confronting, actually. Probably stupid, really, when I think back at it. It had been done before me, but only a couple of times. But I went down. I went down over King Island, which was a long way over water. These days they tend to go over Flinders Island, but I went over King Island, and yeah, it's a long way, especially in a little 2-stroke aeroplane over the water. But so lots of
Did they have the
adventures.
regular call signs and call in and check in at that stage?
No, look, most of the flying I did in those days was totally unsupported. We rarely had radios in the aeroplane, actually, especially when we were delivering them. I did in that case at a VHF, but we were outside of radio range for quite a bit of that flight. Often we'd deliver an aeroplane. They weren't standardised with radios, so the farmers in the bush just ordered an aeroplane. Sometimes it had a UHF, so you could talk to the truckies, but that was often it. Rudimentary instruments. Most of my initial ferry flying was done completely without GPS as well, which was interesting.
Must have been good training.
Yeah, well, it was an adventure and fantastic, and scary moments sometimes, but it was great. So I kind of did that as I moved into general aviation as well. I kept doing a bit of that ferry flying, but I ended up working at as a general aviation flying instructor at Archerfield. That was my next move for Barry Hempel, who's quite a renowned aviator and a bit of a rogue. Yeah, who's sadly no longer with us, but I was with Barry for quite a few years there, and that was another complete education for me.
Because he was quite a well-renowned stunt pilot.
Yeah. So I think Barry took a bit of a shine to me because I was into the ultralights and tailwheel aircraft and aerobatics and that sort of thing. So he put me on as a casual instructor, and then eventually, full time. And I was with him for a few years there. And we did everything there. We did absolutely everything. I flew all sorts of aeroplanes. Crazy stuff would come in, and I'd get to fly it. So I flew lots of tailwheel aeroplanes, lots of aerobatic aeroplanes, and vintage aircraft, including about 300 hours in the beautiful Tiger Moth, which is like a very famous old Second World War biplane trainer, but more or less like a drifter to fly because you're out in the open and it's a stick and rudder machine. So. It was a fascinating time there. I learned a lot, and the place was a complete madhouse. And I saw so many, both with ultralights and that sort of early period in GA, I was fortunate enough to see so many characters in aviation, which, I think are tending to be bred out of it a little bit now. It's all become a bit sterile, maybe for the better. But people like Barry Hempel were just incredible characters. More at home in the air than they were on the ground, and Barry was certainly a flawed character, that's for sure, but an amazing pilot, probably the best I've ever seen, and maybe the best I'll ever see. He could fly anything, and he could do it intuitively and without even thinking. So he'd get out of the tiniest little home-built aeroplane or ultralight, and his next aeroplane would be the MiG-15 or a King Air or a Citation jet or something. Absolutely incredible. So and Barry's concept to checking me out on aeroplanes was he had a big handlebar moustache, and it was usually, Barry, what have I got to fly today? And he'd point me towards some horrendous aeroplane I'd never flown before it, and he'd just say, "Just get in it, McKeown, just get in it and fly. It's just another aeroplane," twiddling his moustache at the same time. So. Yeah, I sort of learnt pretty quick on the job there.
Well, it was quite ironic. Then he was actually killed in an aeroplane accident.
Yeah, look, the circumstances of his death were horrendous and very tragic, and we can take nothing away from that. But to say that the likes of that guy, it would be very hard to imagine them living to old age. And that might sound a bit strange, but. Some of those characters, were only in their element when they were in the air, and you could never imagine them sitting on a couch with a blanket across their knees as old people. But yeah, it takes nothing away from the fact that it's a very tragic accident.
You talk about how he was the best that you'd flown with or seen. What was it like to actually sit in the second seat when he was at the controls?
Look, it was breathtaking. Barry was a great pilot, but a terrible instructor, and I think that's often can be the case with really good pilots. They expect everyone to be exactly the same as them, but I always enjoyed flying with Barry, and I can remember actually not long before his death flying with him in the Yak 52, and we took off from Watts Bridge over in the Brisbane Valley there, and we had to ferry the thing home. And on the way back, he said, "McKeown, have you ever seen an inverted spin?" Now, if anyone knows anything about aviation, spinning's pretty dramatic as it is. It's a good thing to learn and to train for, but it's a pretty dramatic activity, and inverted spinning's even more dramatic. So what you've basically got to do is take an aeroplane and roll it upside down so you're in inverted flight, so you're hanging in your straps. And then you perform a stall upside down. So you push the stick forward, which pushes the nose up while you're upside down until the wing stalls. And then you end up, if you do it right, you boot the rudder in and you end up in this horrendous gyrating, upside down, wild, screaming sort of, death descent. And I can remember being in this thing and trying to hold onto the controls and trying to hold it in this inverted spin, and Hempel very calmly in the back just twiddling his moustache and going, "Now you're coming down pretty fast, McKeown, aren't you?" And our rate of descent was out of this world, But anyway, we recovered from that, and as we recovered, we were below the tree line, and my heart was pounding. And anyway, we flew home, and then I said, "Well, would you like to have a fly, Barry?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, I'll have a little turn." And he grabbed the controls, and look, we were down sort of in a valley just north of Mount Mee there, and he did this little display in the valley, in amongst the hills, as the sun was going down that it was a privilege to watch it. We were vertical and then we're down pointing at the ground, then we were upside down and twisting around. I was an aerobatic pilot, but even the stuff he was doing was just blowing me away. But the naturalness of it was incredible, the fact that the aeroplane was moving like it was an extension of his arms and legs. And, that sounds a bit corny, but that's exactly what it was. And that's what it was like to fly with Barry. Yeah.
Why get into aerobatics?
I think aerobatics are a natural progression for anyone that's really interested in flying and exploring their aeroplane, because you don't want to fly around having any sort of grey areas in your knowledge of the aeroplane or its envelope. And I always, I don't want to fly around thinking, I wonder what would happen if I was upside down, or I wonder what would happen if I was in a spin or something like that. I would prefer to see it, and do it and make sure I'm comfortable with it. So there's that element, but it's also great fun. It's really good fun to be able to twist and turn and climb up vertically and dive around the cloud and roll and loop and all that sort of stuff. So it's terrific fun. In fact, my wonderful business partner Marty Power and I go flying and do aerobatics together. We, even now, having flown most of our working lives, we giggle and squeal and carry on like schoolgirls when we're doing aerobatics. So it's just good fun.
What haven't you done that you want to do, though, in the aviation field? We'll get onto the commercial aviation in a bit, but is there something that you still want to do?
That's a really good question. I haven't really asked myself before. I guess at the moment we're developing the business, so I've got a little flying school.
Well, let's talk about the flying school. It's recreational flying company. Tell us all about that, how that got off the ground.
So when I joined my first airline, which was in about 2004, it was Virgin Blue in those days, I got rostered one day to fly with a captain who's only a couple of years older than me, by the name of Marty Power. And when you go into to do a flight in the airline, the first thing you do is walk into the crew room. And if you imagine there's just a series of computer consoles there and a fax machine and a clerk, and you go and do your flight planning, you sign in, and you meet. That's where you meet your team. So if you're an FO, you'll meet your captain, and if you're the captain, you'll meet your FO, and you discuss the flight plan together, talk about the fuel load, and then you move from there out to the coffee shop and then the aeroplane. Anyway, so I was in there one day signing on, and this guy, not much older than me, pulled up beside me with curly black hair and no hat. Never wore a hat in the airline and still doesn't. But he pulled up beside me, and the usual small talk ensued. How's your morning, that sort of thing. And when I asked Marty how was his morning, he said, "Oh yeah, pretty good. I've been flying." And I went, "Oh, that's a bit interesting," because not every airline pilot enjoys flying outside of the airlines. There are some enthusiasts in there, but not all. So, of course, being an enthusiast myself, it immediately pricked up my attention, and I said, "Oh, what in?" And he said, "Oh, Tiger Moth." And I went, "Oh, of course, So suddenly we had a rapport straight away, and he said, "What have you been doing?" And I said, "Oh, I've been flying in my drifter." So once we sort of worked out that we were both keen on flying outside of aviation, we hit it off straight away, and we had a trip together and just talked non-stop about nerdy aviation history and aircraft and all the sorts of things we'd like to fly. And I think we parted company at the end of the trip, which was 4 days, and we might have done another trip together. And I saw Marty down the track at some point, and he was saying he was selling his Tiger Moth. So I said, "Well, why don't we get an aeroplane together?" And so we decided to go in together in an aircraft, and we bought a Piper Cub, a little yellow J3 1945 Piper Cub, which we later ferried up from Melbourne. And when we got the Cub, we thought, well, we've really got to do something with it to justify its existence. So we thought, well, why don't we do a little bit of training? Two men and a Piper Cub. We'll just do some really low-key, small-scale tail wheel, stick and rudder sort of training on the side. Well, that was fine. That lasted, not a very long time at all. We started doing a little bit of that. We got a little caravan and used that as our briefing office. then a hangar came up on the field at Gympie, and it was a big hangar, and so we jumped on that and we got it, but it was a bit big just for the Piper Cub, so we ended up having to get another couple of aeroplanes, and then to justify that we had to sort of put ourselves out for more work and employ some instructors, and anyway, before we knew it, this little concept had turned into a complete and utter monster. And that's the recreational flying company that we still operate today, some nearly 14 years later.
Where have you sent pilots to?
Well, we've taught people from all walks of life to fly. We do just about everything. So we still do training in things like the Drifter and recreational training in an aircraft called the Foxbat. But we go all the way through to commercial and instrument rating and multi-engine flying and all that sort of thing. So a vast array of students from all sorts of places. So I've got kids as young as 15 learning to fly, because you can get a license, an ultralight license at 15, or a recreational license we call it these days. We've even taught an 80-year-old guy to fly, and everything in between. But our commercial pilot graduates are kind of all over the place. We've got guys flying in the Air Force now, and
Wow.
guys flying up in Darwin doing charter activity over there. Some people have gone overseas. We had a cohort of Taiwanese students for a while who are an absolute delight for us. So they've moved on to Taiwan, and some of them picked up airline work and cadetships and things like that. So, but a huge proportion of our flying is still with recreational pilots who come from all sorts of backgrounds, locals, sometimes they're from further afield, but they just want to learn to fly for fun, so they'll learn to fly in the Foxbat or the Cessna or whatever they want to get into, and they just enjoy taking their friends and family for flights around the local area, or maybe further afield.
Do you enjoy instructing?
Yes, Mike, I love it, and I always have, and I think, I mean, that's what gave me my start originally, but I've always retained an interest in it, and I've now been fortunate enough to instruct at every level, from ultralights in the Drifter all the way through to 737 and transport aircraft, and I get a real buzz out of it still. And it has its frustrating moments, obviously, but when you're teaching someone else to fly, obviously you relive all your own training experiences, and it's not always easy. Some people do it easier than others, but it's not always easy, and the student has some moments where they nearly give up because it's become too hard, or they have a learning plateau. And so as an instructor, you really need to not only nurture the skills and develop their talents as a pilot, but you've got to help them work through these little training hurdles and difficulties, and go with them on the journey, I suppose, to becoming a pilot. And that's a thankless task at times, I can tell you, but the rewards when you get there together as a team, and you've created another pilot or sent someone solo, is just the most amazing thing, and it's a reward that keeps on delivering. In fact, when you send someone solo as an instructor, it's the next best thing to your own first solo that we talked about at the start of the program. And I guess it's a bit selfish, but as an instructor, you get to keep doing that over and over again, whereas most pilots only experience it once.
So there's that feeling, that elation. Do you get elated when they don't know, when you're actually pulling the belts, and it's like, okay, your turn now? How do you sort of equate to stepping out of the plane or sending someone off?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting experience as an instructor too, because you have to step away. You have to give the student the responsibility to do that, and that's probably the hardest thing, is detaching yourself from it and letting go. You try and do all the right things. You try to make sure you've given them all the training and all the experiences they need to keep themselves safe on the first solo, but you never quite know. You never quite know. Have I done enough? Is he going to be okay? And we've got a few little, parameters that we check off to make sure that's going to happen, but you never quite know. So it's completely nerve-wracking as an instructor stepping out of the aeroplane. Most students hate to hear this, but it is. So we step out, and we've got to be the calm voice of authority and encourage them, and we've got to give them the tap on the shoulder and say, righto mate, off you go. We tie the seatbelt up ceremoniously, in the instructor's station. We look around, make sure all the cockpit controls are set for takeoff. So give the student a bit of a hand with that. a quick pep talk, but not too long. We don't want to belabor it, so we give them a quick pep talk on what we want them to do, and just mention that the aeroplane will get off the ground a bit earlier. Remember that myself. It'll climb a bit faster. It might float a little bit longer on landing, but it's going to fly exactly the same as it's been on the last 10 circuits that you've done with me in the back. So off you go. Have a great time, and see when you get back. You're flying really well. But then I step away, and yeah, look, it's a terrifying experience. I go and say a little prayer for them, even though I'm not religious, and I go and sit on the side of the runway. We hide on the side of the runway so they can't see us, because if they see us when they're on final, they might get a bit nervous. So we hide there, and I sit there and I wish them well. But then it's up to them, So then they get in the aeroplane, and their training takes over, and they take off. And they come around and land, but man, that moment they touch the ground, and often as not, it's a beautiful landing, because they're concentrating hard, and they've got the skills.
Sweating bullets,
yeah. But we are too, So they get it down, and you just the sense of euphoria and relief is unbelievable. So then we run up to them and congratulate them and share that moment together, and it is just the most magical experience. And I've had grown men just bawling their eyes out after they've gone solo, because it's just so overwhelming, the experience, and it's hard not to share that experience with them as well.
Because I've been around the recreational flying company when there have been certain milestones for people, and there's a real camaraderie for pilots. What do you put that down to?
Yeah, that's right, and I suppose that's one of the things that attracted me to the profession as well, and particularly the pathway that I've taken with recreational flying, where that seems to be very, very strong indeed. There is a bit of an esprit de corps there, and maybe it's the shared experience. Everyone remembers their own achievement. Things like going solo or getting a license are things that a pilot will appreciate more than your mum or dad or your mates will. You'll go solo and go home and say, I went solo today, and someone might say, oh, that's nice, dear, But when you're talking to another pilot, they go, oh, wow, what was it like? What was it in? Where did you go? How was the landing? That sort of thing. So I think that those shared experiences are what creates that rapport and that camaraderie. And I've seen that too in companies. So, I was on the lucky enough to fly the Embraer jet at Virgin for a while, which was a smaller aircraft than the 737, just as capable, probably better than the 737. But we were sort of the black sheep squadron. We were a smaller community of pilots, and we grew the aeroplane from its introduction pretty well till they got rid of them. And the camaraderie in that group was wonderful. I remember my time in the Kimberley as the chief pilot of a big charter company in the Kimberley. We had 25 young pilots, not much older than me. I was probably one of the youngest ones there, but I was the boss for a while, God knows how. But we had 25 pilots, and we used to fly in the Kimberley, which is an amazing sort of remote region, and particularly in the wet season, very, very difficult flying. But we used to fly hard, and we'd play pretty hard too. We had a pretty good sort of social life. But that community of pilots up there have remained lifelong friends for me. So, these groups and communities of pilots are pretty wonderful. In fact, my wife often says to me, "Oh, Paul, you don't have any friends that aren't pilots." And I'm like, well, I haven't found too many people that aren't pilots that I'm interested in at the moment. So,
well, I suppose you're surrounding yourself with pilots anyway. So it's, when you're in the RAF, for want of a better example, they associate with other RAFies.
Yeah, that's right, and it's probably a little bit of a narrow, take on the world. That's not to say I don't like people that aren't pilots, for sure. I've got many friends that don't fly, but yeah, there's a particular thing when you're around other pilots, you can talk about things and talk that language that we
especially
speak.
When you have the passion for it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Has it died? Is it still there? The passion that you first got, that first solo that you had, is the passion still there?
Sometimes, Mark, I wish it would go away, but it doesn't. And one of my wonderful old mentors, a wonderful old flying instructor by the name of Terry Monty, who I met when I was at Bonnet, and was the first guy to give me the book Fate is a Hunter, which is one of these famous flying books, and really instilled in me some of the the lore and ethos of stick and rudder flying. He always used to say, well, flying's worse than a drug, Paul. I thought, why is that, Terry? Because you can give drugs up.
Can you see a time when you won't be flying, or is it something you always think you'll do?
Of course, I'd like to fly forever, you know, and getting back to your question I couldn't answer before, what is there left to do? Well, for me, everything's left to do, you know. There's so many aeroplanes out there that I'd like to fly, and so many experiences I'd like to have, and so many places I'd like to fly to. So, in fact, flying is the ultimate enterprise for a person like me with a short attention span, because there's always something else to do, another rating to achieve or another aircraft to fly. So as long as there's aeroplanes and manned flight, I'll want to keep flying. But of course, you know, we've got to be realistic about it. And there is a point where your skills start to, you know, fall away a little bit. And I, you know, as an instructor, I've been witness to that as well. When you've got older pilots that probably are flying beyond the point when they should and don't recognise it. So I think that, you know, to be realistic, there will be a time when I won't fly anymore. And hopefully I'll still have the airmanship to be able to recognise that and make the decision when it comes. But a long way from that yet, I hope.
What makes a good pilot?
Yeah, good question. So we talk about you know, two pillars, you know, holding up the ideal pilot. One is the physical flying skills. You know, you've got to be able to fly the aeroplane, and even despite the fact that aviation's come so far and modern aircraft are so automated and so amazing, you know, they can do so much by themselves. I know from my personal experience, even flying transport aircraft and airlines, there have been moments when I've had to fall back on my physical flying skills, you know, that I learnt in the gliders and ultralights and aerobatic aeroplanes and so on. So you've got to be able to fly, at least at the moment, you've got to still be able to fly the aeroplane. So hand-eye, foot coordination, spatial awareness, those sorts of things are really important. Being able to sort of feel what's going on in the aeroplane almost before it happens. So you've got to be able to fly. But the other pillar is your sense of what we call airmanship. And airmanship are things like your decision-making skills and your adherence to procedure and rules, and, you know, being able to make sound judgments, look after your crew, use the resources around you, you know, in an emergency or a difficult situation to get the best outcome. So what we're looking for in a pilot is these two things, you know. It's not good enough to just have one or the other. You've got to have both. So when we're going through the training process, they're the things that we're trying to develop in a new pilot.
And is that in just right from the start, or in the commercial world? What are you trying to do? Is it just something that goes right across the board?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we try to start with those concepts right from the earliest stages of a student's training. In fact, you know, a student gets in a tiny little aeroplane like a drifter or a glider. We tell them, hey, you're the captain of this aeroplane. You're in charge of it. You know, it's not a matter of just flying it with the stick and rudder. You've got to make decisions about it. You know, you've got to choose when you fly and when you don't fly. You've got an engine, you've got to choose to go around if the landing's not looking good. You know, you've got to look after your passenger if you've got one. So we develop those sort of those attitudes right from the start, and that's the best way to do it.
What are some of the poor decisions you've made while you're in the
well, we could be here for a long time, but I'm very fortunate that none of them have killed me, you know, and I've lost quite a few acquaintances over the years, and I've been lucky. You know, some people, aviation is not, you know, there's an old saying that says aviation is not inherently dangerous, but to a much greater extent than the sea, it is terribly unforgiving of any carelessness, incapacity or neglect. And there's certainly been times when I've been careless, but I've been fortunate enough to get away with it. But yeah, look, there's been a few times you know, there's one particular case that just springs to mind when I was flying an aeroplane called a Sonori, which is a little two-seat home-built aeroplane, very fast, like an air racing styled aeroplane. I was flying around Boonah in this thing, zooming around, and I thought, I'll just do a bit of an inverted glide. It's not an aerobatic aeroplane, so I shouldn't have been doing it in the first place. But I rolled the aeroplane upside down, pushed the stick forward, which we do to sort of achieve a bit of negative G. And as I did that, I heard a clunk in the back of the aeroplane, and the controls suddenly froze. So the ailerons wouldn't work at all, and they're the control that used to roll the aeroplane. So I had no way of rolling it back up the right way, which is really quite, you know, disconcerting experience. I thought, this isn't good. And I had my little pal on board too, and you know, I really shouldn't have put him in the situation. And we weren't that high. We were probably about 2,000 feet and losing height very rapidly. The engine stops when you're upside down as well. So now we got no control, no engine, and didn't really know what to do. So I pushed the rudder in, and I kind of, was able to rudder the aeroplane around using the secondary control. And I got it back up the right way, and there was another clunk, and the controls started working again. And anyway, I was much chastened. I came back and landed and had a little think about it. And the aeroplane had a folding wing mechanism. And the way the aileron controls were designed, it wasn't designed for flying upside down. And when I put it upside down, the aileron linkages went over centre and they locked the ailerons out. So obviously I could have avoided the whole sorry situation if I didn't put the aeroplane upside down. Decision making, 101.
Absolutely. And how did you feel though when you are losing height and you're thinking, oh my goodness, what now?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I just thought, well, that was stupid, wasn't it, Paul? But fortunately, I was able to sort of, manoeuvre my way out of the situation just by, bit of luck and good design, I suppose. But this is back to the decision making. It shouldn't have happened in the first place. But I've had other. That's a poor decision. I've had other incidents where the problem has been neglect. So I remember one incident in particular, again down at Bonnet, when I was instructing in a drifter. So I'm in the back seat of the drifter, the students in the front, and it had been a big day. I'd done about 4 or 5 hours of training, and it was the last flight of the day. And the student was doing some forced landings. He was a pretty good student. And when we simulate a forced landing, what we do is the instructor pulls the throttle back to idle, and we say simulated engine failure. And the student goes through his procedure, puts the nose down, adopts the glide attitude, and starts to manoeuvre towards a simulated landing in a paddock. But before we get there, we usually put the power on and go around, and we might do another one, or we might go home. Anyway, I must have gone to sleep a bit, and the student was just turning base, so turning at 90 degrees to the paddock, about to start his final approach on the simulated paddock. And we sort of got behind a hill a bit, and it must have been some unusual atmospheric effects. The student sort of mishandled his turn, and before I knew it, we departed normal flight. So we started an incipient spin. So that's when the aeroplane stalls, its wing stops flying, the wing drops off, and the aeroplane starts yawing and rolling into a spin, which is, unless you recover, is catastrophic. We're really low, like we're about 500 feet at this stage, and the ground is just rushing up towards me, faster than I've ever seen in my life. And the drifter's pretty draggy little aeroplane, and you have to get the nose down quite a long way to recover from a stall. I just grabbed the controls and I just threw it into the spin recovery technique, which is shoving the stick forward and opposite rudder in, and I kind of just recovered the aeroplane at about fence top height. I went to full power, and we were so low that we actually hit the ground in the recovery. So fortunately it was an open paddock. We hit the ground, the fence is rushing up towards us, and I thought, oh, this must be what it feels like to die, right? We're about to die. And, thanks to God and the little Rotax on the back, we managed to bounce back up in the air. The little thing clawed the air and managed to get enough lift to just get us over the fence. And then we somehow managed to stay in the air and eventually get enough flying speed to climb away. And I flew back. We flew back in silence to Gympie and and landed. And and after I'd calmed down, the old instructor voice comes back and says, so what do you think went wrong there? Blogs. But I don't think even that came out with much more than just a squeak. But I came back to Gympie, and anyway, the student went home, and I really dwelled on that a lot. That night when I was filling in my logbook, I filled in that flight and totaled up my hours, and unbelievably, that flight where I probably came the closest to dying that I ever have in an aircraft was the very flight that I ticked over my first 1,000 hours of flying.
Wow. And
it was such a good lesson for me, Mark, because I realised that at that point I was just probably starting to get a bit good at what I was doing and a bit cocky, and that's a really bad thing in aviation. So it was a great reminder for me that no matter how much experience I've got, your mind has to always be on the job. You can't let your guard down because those little things creep up on you so quickly.
Because there are some milestones they do say where pilots do have to be aware and take care, like 100 hours is another one. I remember that when you're around the 100 hours that you might just sort of start to think that you're a little bit better than you actually are.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's why, aviation statistics are are often punctuated with accidents from involving pilots who are very experienced. Even old Barry Hempel. So a good reminder, and I was lucky enough to get away with it, to get the warning, but a lot of people don't, obviously. But again, aviation has no ability to handle carelessness, incapacity, or neglect. You always do a good pre-flight before you go flying. Make a good decision. There's days when you shouldn't go flying. You look at the weather and you think, you know what, today I'm not going to go. We make a self-assessment too. It's even, we call it a human factor. So there'll be days when you're just not on your game, you're just not feeling right or up to it, your judgment's not there. They're the days not to go flying. So in that sense, in many ways, it's fully controllable, provided you see what's going on, you make those decisions early, and you always keep your mind on the job.
It sounds like you, though, have been kissed by the aviation fairy, that you've got away with some things that maybe other people haven't. Do you think that it's your training in the early days that have helped you out in those, you had the split-second reflexes?
Possibly. I'd say my training certainly helps. There's a little bit of luck involved too. Definitely in the cases where I've made a poor decision, it's a bit of luck involved. I remember taking off in a Tiger Moth at Archfield one day, with a passenger on board, a paying passenger, unforgivable really. And the engine was running a bit rough when I ran it up. Not uncommon in a Tiger Moth. It's a 60-year-old aeroplane. And they run a bit rough sometimes, and often it will clear, as you put the throttle on and accelerate for takeoff. And I had a fair bit of time in Tiger Moths, but I remember rolling out of onto the runway and accelerating, and the thing was still running rough, and I should have given it away. I should have closed the throttle and stopped the takeoff, but I didn't. I thought, it'll clear, but it didn't clear. So I scraped the thing into the air, probably just missed the trees off the end of runway 28 at Archfield, and I staggered around the circuit. I think the tower must have hit the crash button, but I managed to sort of, half fly around the circuit and land again and taxi in, and I survived that. That's what we call a partial engine failure. Quite dangerous because it's insidious. You don't know if it's stopped or it hasn't. But I managed to get away with it. Now, not long after that event, actually one of my former students who had gone on to buy his own aeroplane had a similar event, took off from Boonah again in a home-built aeroplane with a partial engine failure, didn't abort the takeoff, tried to stagger around the circuit and flew into rising ground, hit a power line and crashed, and he and his passenger were incinerated. So,
wow.
I got away with it. He didn't, and so, I don't know. Sometimes I've been a bit lucky, I suppose.
But you've had the passion all this time. Let's go back to the study and the work that you went to become a commercial airline pilot. You were doing a couple of jobs as an instructor. Talk us through the work to get into the commercial aviation industry.
Aviation has many ups and downs. At the moment, there's a big down because of the COVID-19. You can see the pictures of all the aeroplanes on the ground. Whilst we haven't seen anything quite this dramatic before, even in my career I've seen many ups and downs, and it was a down when I was getting into it. So whilst flying was going okay at the recreational level, it's very, very difficult to get into an airline. In fact, the old joke was even Sunstate, the regional airline at that stage, you had to wait for someone to die to get into. So it was very hard to get in. I was in GA, or general aviation, a long time before the airlines finally accepted me. So, which was, in its own way, a wonderful experience, because I got to do so many different and varied things. But it was a long time in GA, about 10 years before I managed to get into the airline, or a bit more. All the while trying to, prepare myself for it. So, you do the study, and everything in aviation is sort of cumulative. So, you'll pass one qualification, you'll start studying for the next. But I kind of had to do it while I was working. So I would do a day's instructing at Boonah, and I'd, initially I was working at night. Later on, when I didn't have to work at night, I'd be back in the Donga studying my manuals. I wasn't a gifted academic when it came to the flying theory, so I always just struggled through with my theory exams.
That's really surprising. But you would have blitzed it.
Yeah, well, I probably now that I've have instructed for a while, I'm a very practical person, so I have to see meaning in something in order to learn it. So for me, just opening the textbook, the dry sort of material never really worked. Now that I've got some experience and I've seen everything that I've learnt put into practice, it's much more meaningful for me. So I'm okay at it now, and I think I'm better at explaining it as well. But yeah, in those days I was hopeless. So my Atpl exam, the air transport pilot exams, which are the last exams before you get the final license, which is the air transport license, are very, very difficult in Australia. Probably the most difficult in the world, with maybe the possible exception of the UK. So they're really hard, and I nearly didn't get through them. So I think you had 3 years to get through 7 exams or something, and I think you might have got 3 chances at each exam. Well, I passed the last and hardest exam on the last month of the last year of the last go at the exam that I could before they were all sort of null and void, and I passed by 1%. The pass mark was 70. I think I got 71% on ATPL flight planning, which is a hard exam. So certainly no gifted scholar of aviation theory, but I managed to get through all that, God knows how. And then eventually I was flying in Western Australia, flying a King Air turboprop aeroplane for BHP when I finally got the call up for Virgin. And that was my first entry into the airline world.
The call up from Virgin, that must have been a pretty specky day.
Yeah, well, it was. I mean, I've never probably really had my heart set on the airline business, but as a pilot, you just keep going. You keep going as far as you could, and I suppose it would just seem natural that that's what you do. So, I probably didn't have a burning ambition to be an airline pilot like some other pilots do, but I was still chuffed to get there. And
so you just wanted to fly?
Yeah, and obviously, big aeroplane, fast aeroplane, jets. Who doesn't want to do that, right? I didn't particularly want to take them, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne with a travelling public and a hat on my head, but I just wanted to fly the aeroplanes. In fact, if the airline had have just given me the aircraft to go flying at, at 10 o'clock in the morning, go and take the jet for a fly, Paul, I would have loved it. There's some other more undesirable things about the airline business. But I remember when I finally got the job at Virgin after trying for so long. One of the first people I rang up was Barry Hempel, and I got on the phone and said, "Oh, Barry, I've finally made it. I've got into Virgin." And you know what his answer to me was? "Oh, what about aviation?" Like he just thought, well, you're leaving us, you're leaving real flying to go to the airlines. And in a sense, I was, but it was the start of a new profession, new adventure, I suppose.
How much control on these big aircrafts? How much real flying are you doing?
Look, the automation is incredible. The systems are incredible, but you still need humans, at least at the moment. It's funny though how it works. I mean, these days the simulation is so good that you do all of your type rating training in a simulator. So when I did my 737 type rating, it was all in the simulator. I never flew the aeroplane in training. So my first ever landing in a real 737, this might horrify some people, was on a red-eye flight back from Perth to Brisbane, and with 180 people in the back. And this is my first ever go at landing the thing. You've got a training captain sitting beside you, but there I was. And, I can remember just being absolutely overwhelmed by the experience. Again, so many times in aviation. But anyway, I don't even know how I got it on the ground, but I managed to get it on, and, that was another little milestone done.
How did your mother feel when she'd given you the $1,000 to continue your aviation studies and career? How did she feel when you finally got the big call up?
Look, I'm sure my parents have always been pleased for me, whatever I've done, but their expectations have always been very reasonable for me as well. So I think they've always been proud of what I've done, regardless of what it's been, and they would have been just as happy if I had opened a shop or had a paper route or been a garbage collector as an airline pilot. So I'm fortunate in that regard.
Okay, now talking about the airlines, you moved to Virgin. Now, not a lot of people would know about seniority and how that operates. Could you share that, how the seniority in an airline, so you really have to stay with the one airline.
Yeah, look, that's a really interesting question, and it's an interesting topic of discussion because in Australia and I guess for legacy carriers in most of the parts of the world, the airline runs on a seniority system, which means that you start at the bottom rank, and the time you are in the airline determines, your position in the hierarchy, and that will determine, when you come up for a command. Obviously you've still got to get through your command training and be found to be acceptable, but it's seniority based more than merit based in many ways. But it also determines things like, who gets the best holidays, who gets the best money, all that sort of stuff. The problem with the aviation business, or at least the legacy aviation airlines, are that if you leave the company, all the seniority's gone. So you could be at the top of your game in an airline as a senior check captain, resign, and you'd have to start at the bottom again with the next airline, which is nuts, right? There's very few professions that I think in the world that would be like that. The proponents of the seniority say, well, it's the only fair system, because it cuts out nepotism and things like that. So when your turn comes, well, you get the prize. But of course, the opponents of it say, well, it stifles people that might be a cut above the rest, and doesn't allow for progressing people on merit rather than an arbitrary system. So look, the jury's out. It's not always that way. Some airlines work on a merit system, but in Australia at least we're stuck with the seniority system. Now, one of the things that it does for pilots is it locks you into a company. And that can be good if you enjoy it there, if you like it, but often as not, people get sick of it. Everyone has a use-by date with their enthusiasm, and if you've been in the same company for 10 or 20 years and you don't want to be there, but you have to, because that's the only place you're going to get that sort of money and rank, it's unbearable for people. So that's reflected in the crew room where pilots, you go in there and pilots whinge and bitch and moan about the company, and well, that's sort of a pilot thing anyway, right? There's an old joke that says, "How do you tell a pilot?" It's when the engine stops, the whining keeps going. So we like to whine and whinge. I think it's part of the personality type. But guys do get stuck in that sort of rut there, and they're unable to leave and do other things. So. Yeah, I got to the stage in Virgin where I was there for 12 years, and I used to always try and enjoy my work. I'd go to work and try and have a good time and have a happy cockpit and everything. And I used to look at these guys in the crew room who were bitter and twisted and whining. And I used to think, well, if I'm ever like that, I'll leave. I won't stay and be unhappy. And so anyway, one day I was like that, and so I had to go. But I decided to leave and go off to another airline, and that was pretty tough actually, because it's like the thing you're familiar with and the thing and it's very uncomfortable to leave that and to
being the senior and then suddenly being the junior.
Yeah. Well, I was fortunate enough that the airline I went to was accepting direct entry captain, so I didn't have to change my rank. But even so, leaving Virgin was it was a difficult experience. I went through the range of human emotions with it. But I'm so glad that I did it, because I realised that you don't have to stay in that system. You can live on your wits in aviation. You might not get to live where you want to live or fly with the airline of your choice, but you can have a whole career outside of the seniority system. And so I was able to do that, and it was a real revelation to me. And the next job I had was great fun too, and so it's been after that.
So you moved to Air Naru at that stage. What happened then?
Well, the funny thing about the Naru job was I was actually looking in I was putting an ad into the job papers for an instructor at the flying school, and while I was in there, I saw Naru Airlines looking for direct entry captains, and I thought, that sounds a bit interesting. I'd seen the beautiful, old but beautiful blue 737s over on the other side of the apron at Brisbane. I was intrigued about it, and it just sounded so exotic, flying these old aeroplanes out across the Pacific to far-flung places and small islands. It sounded like an adventure. So I just, probably without even thinking, I rang I rang the airline, and they put me straight through to the chief pilot, which is unheard of in a large airline like Virgin or Qantas. And I got talking to the chief pilot, Ross Gibson, there, and we immediately struck it off. And he said, "Well, you better come in for a cup of coffee." So I came in for a cup of coffee, and before I knew it, I was being measured up for a uniform and issued the manuals and things. And I thought, oh, geez, I better resign from Virgin before they catch on. So I actually went initially to Virgin and asked for leave without pay, but they didn't want to give it to me because they thought the floodgates would open if they sort of allowed that. So I said, well, you know what, I'll just go. And I resigned and really never looked back. So Naru Airlines was fabulous. A small company, we had 5 737-300s, which are older aircraft. A bit more stick and rudder to fly, not quite as fancy as the new ones Virgin and Qantas have. So that appealed to me. And, man, the places we went to. So, we used to fly a big flight to Nauru. It's nearly 5 hours out to Nauru. But if you can imagine, that's right on the edge of the range of a 737 with the fuel capacity. And you fly for 5 hours over the Pacific, but you see nothing but ocean. And then you arrive at a tiny little speck, which is Nauru is the tip of an undersea volcano. And it's, you can walk around it in half a day. It's got a circumference of about 20 kilometres. It's not much higher than a palm tree. And the airstrip, pretty well goes right across the island. So, then you land on this airstrip and you're in a whole other world. It's really wonderful. But, some big technical challenges there too, because you're right on the edge of the range and there's really nowhere to go if you get there and the weather's bad. You had just enough fuel to get to the next island, but you could never be sure that the weather was okay there as well. So it's quite technically challenging. And because the lack of support out in the islands, you're really kind of on your own. And so that really appealed to me as well. So, and Ross Gibson, the chief pilot, said to me when we had our coffee, he said, Paul, when you put the wheels up in Brisbane, you're on your own. And I went, yeah, great. That's just the way I like it. So in the mainstream airlines, it is quite, it obviously has its moments when you have to sort of use your brain and work hard. But it's very regimented, It's Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, it's rostered, it's controlled, and everything happens when it should happen. But out there, it was just like the Wild West out in the Pacific. And the captain's it, I was in charge of the crew and the aircraft and its disposition and where I went and what I did. And so I really enjoyed that part of the job. But the places we went to were spectacular as well. So Nauru and, Kiribati, up into the Marshall Islands, to Majuro, quite close to Bikini Atoll where the American nuclear testing was.
I think the French let a few off there as well.
Yeah, look, it's a fascinating part of the world, but we never went to Bikini Atoll, but the Marshallese all, of course, remember the nuclear testing. Went to a place called Ponape in Micronesia, which is like something out of Jurassic Park with these amazing, jungle-clad mountains going into the sea and, quite sort of, backward communities, I suppose, but wonderful people and wonderful experiences. So, yeah, look, really good fun. And we had a freighter as well, so we did a bit of freight, and not only did we do the RPT flying around the islands, but we did a lot of charter as well. So at that point, we were doing a lot of the charter for the Department of Immigration, taking the detainees to the various detention centres. So we used to go to Manus Island in New Guinea and out to Nauru and over the Christmas Island in the west. But the freighter did some pretty amazing things too. I remember one day Ross rang up and said, "Oh, we've got a job for you, Paul. You have to get to the freighter in Brisbane, a special cargo." So I rock up to the freighter in Brisbane and it's parked out on a remote stand, like nowhere near the hangars or the terminal or anything. And it's got all these airport sort of vehicles with flashing lights around it and everything. Like, what's going on here? And turns out our cargo was 14 tonne of dynamite and gunpowder, black gunpowder. So we had got a special permit from CASA. We used to kind of do the jobs that no one else would do, right? So we had 14 tonne of gunpowder in the freighter, loaded in boxes, and my job was to take it to Surabaya in Indonesia. Now, where do you get that sort of job, right? So we took off in this thing. We had a special permit from CASA to be able to fly it. I had to avoid all built-up areas. I had to sort of take off and make a steep turn to avoid flying over the CBD of Brisbane. And we flew to Alice Springs, where they were under pains to tell us that we don't really want you here. Get down and refuel as quick as you can and just get out of here because we don't want that stuff near us. So I landed in Alice Springs, refueled, and promptly broke down, which was not an irregular thing in Naru Airlines. But anyway, I eventually got to Surabaya in Indonesia and gently landed the aeroplane, making sure we didn't sort of upset the cargo unnecessarily. Opened the cargo door, and I actually walked away from the aeroplane. I just couldn't watch the unloading because it was going up to the Indonesian military of all places. And so these guys got onto the back of the aeroplane. They started grabbing these boxes of gunpowder and just chucking them out the aeroplane to their mates who would catch them down the bottom.
Typical baggage handlers.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I couldn't watch that happen. But we did that sort of thing. I did charters to Vietnam and all over the place. So it was a really terrific experience.
Why did you leave there?
I left there because I was really sort of enticed to go to China. I didn't want to keep doing the airline flying forever. I'm running the flying school at the same time, and I was pretty thinly stretched between the two jobs always, and never doing either of them as well as I probably could. So I always kind of wanted to get back to the flying school and do GA flying. That's what I really wanted to do. But I had kids at private school, and I needed to try and secure my finances a little bit. So at that stage, some of the Chinese airlines were offering incredible contracts for Australian pilots. So a 3-year contract in China was financially like 10 years over here. So I thought, well, I've still got youth on my side. It's probably I could do it. The work's there now. Let's have a go. It seemed like another adventure to me as well. So I went to China, and that was the start of a whole new sort of adventure as well.
What was the training like there?
It was a real culture shock actually, becoming a pilot in China. I'd had a lot of experience already, but it was almost like starting again. They've got some big cultural differences, but their training was really tough. So we had to do the Chinese, ATP theory again. We had to do all their, company induction stuff. And then we had to do the simulator training and then their line training. And their simulator training is unbelievably difficult. So, I'd been through a lot of sims in Australia, and no airline pilot likes going in the simulator. They're fun things for people that aren't pilots, but pilots cringe when they have to go in a sim because...
Yeah, why is that?
Because whilst in the real aeroplane nothing ever goes wrong, in the simulator nothing ever goes right. So the check captain sits behind you in a big chair like Captain Kirk, and his job is to just torment you for the 4 hours that you're in there, and it's engine failures and fires and difficult scenarios, and that's how we refresh our skills every 6 months as pilots. But the Chinese system was just absolutely over the top. It was like multiple complex failures, one on top of the other, and really designed to see if you cracked, I suppose. That was certainly difficult. No, I managed to sort of scrape my way through the simulator training for reasons I can't explain, but I managed to bluff my way through. We were assigned Chinese first officers who were pretty low-time pilots for the simulator, but they were terrific. They were really good help. They knew the aeroplane backwards. They lacked experience, but they knew their stuff and they knew the numbers, so they were great support for you going through that process. But even though it was difficult, I actually found it quite invigorating because I saw so many different things that I'd never seen in Australia, so many different failures and complex things. So by the end of the process, whilst unpleasant, I felt like I could handle anything in the aeroplane. And this is after having flown in the airlines for quite a number of years. I've never felt trained as well as I did when I finished my training in China. So I was quite impressed with that. And they put a lot of emphasis into training and development as well. So
did that surprise you that they put so much?
It really did. And as an instructor, it really thrilled me, I suppose. So we'd have these horrendous, difficult sims, but they'd also give you training sims. So you'd have 4 or 5 training sims before one of these diabolical check flights. And that was great. That's something that we just don't quite see in the West because, time is money and they give you the minimum usually that's required. Now, the equivalent standard probably is produced at the end, but I was really impressed with the emphasis they put on training in China, if not the checks. But the other thing that impressed me in China was the scale of the aviation infrastructure. So their airports and their airways are just something to behold. So, over here, I don't know how long it's taken us to get the second runway, underway in Sydney, but in the same amount of time in China, they've probably built 100 airports. And these are big airports, maybe with 3 or 4 big 4,000 metre runways, 4 ILS instrument landing system approaches, terminals like, something from outer space, glass sort of, and stainless.
Sort of Changi standard.
Yeah, really, really impressive. So they had the stuff, and there's more aeroplanes flying over there than I've ever seen in my life.
Wow,
So
you just don't think about China as...
No, you really don't, and we probably in the West, and particularly in Australia, we exist in a bit of a bubble, and we often think we're sort of God's gift to aviation and we know all about it, but I tell you what, in terms of infrastructure and the scale of the operation, they leave us for dead over there. Things also worked very well, so, in Australia, as an airline pilot's frustration is, often, you're waiting around, where, you're on the phone, where are the passengers, where's the refueler, the system doesn't always work for you, but over there it was like clockwork. So we had, you'd get picked up from the crew hotel in the morning, you'd get taken to the stairs of the aeroplane, you'd walk up, straight into the cockpit, close the door, I'd never see the passengers. Passengers would come in, I'd go flying, come out, passengers would go. Everything was where it needed to be at the right time. The refueler was always there. The aeroplane was always immaculately presented, well maintained. The crew were looked after. So it was incredible. So, it was a case of you were expected to perform, you had to perform, or they'd fail you summarily. It's pretty brutal. But if you did perform, they looked after you really, really well. And that was professionally very rewarding. Yeah.
What sort of stuff did you see in China? Because not a lot of people get over there, and also you'd see it from a fairly unique perspective. What sort of things that stood out to you from flying around China?
Yeah, well, it's a really strange environment, especially as a Westerner, because whilst aviation is English is the aviation language, and everywhere else in the world they speak English. In China, they speak Chinese on the radio. Now, they'll speak English to me because on my flight plan it says English-speaking captain, but everything else is happening in Chinese. So when you're flying around, you're not only listening to the radio calls to your aircraft, but you're listening to the whole environment around you to sort of get a bit of an idea of what's going on, the
situational awareness.
The situational awareness, the lay of the land. So you haven't got that. So it's kind of like flying a little bubble, You've got your FO, who's Chinese and can translate, but, they're only helpful to a point. So that was a bit unusual. Scenery-wise, yeah, really, really interesting. But of course, with the pollution over there, and it's not just pollution. Actually, they've got some topographical factors there that make the sky almost always hazy, and often low cloud and poor visibility. So often you wouldn't see the ground. So you'd take off, you'd lift off straight into the soup, and you'd bust up above it, and so you'd be flying around above it, but then you wouldn't see the ground until you're 200 feet on final approach. But the days you could see the ground, I saw some amazing things. So I've flown right past the North Korean border. I look out my window and there's North Korea, and right up to Changchun up in the north of China, where it was minus 40 degrees outside, and snow and ice on the runway. I've never had to deal with that sort of thing before, so that was amazing. I've been up into the west of China, to places like Chongqing, where I can remember busting out of the cloud on final approach, and I'd never been there before. And I looked out my window, and I mean this is well in the centre of China. It's like being in Alice Springs, right, in the Flinders Ranges. There's mountains all around, and I looked out the window and there's a ship. There's a ship there, like a container ship, and I thought that's like seeing a ship in Alice Springs, right, up in the mountains, and it's in the Yangtze River, and these things navigate all the way up the Yangtze from Shanghai.
Wow.
Yeah, some absolutely incredible things, and aeroplanes everywhere. So
Really?
Constantly aeroplanes above you, below you, all around, and often that really constrains your freedom of manoeuvre. If there's any weather or anything, can't go left, can't go right, can't go up, can't go down. Can be quite tricky. But yeah, we used to do that, and fly a bit of international flying as well. So one of the lovely flights we used to do was go from Xiamen, where I was based, down to Bangkok, and that flight would take you right past Hong Kong, and Guangzhou, and that huge big, megalopolis that's around that bottom part of China. Then we'd go over Hainan Island and then down the spine of Vietnam, and see the colours of the scenery in Vietnam that you associate with all those pictures of the war and everything. And then down into Bangkok, absolutely wonderful little things like that, up to Japan and Korea. So, yeah, pretty amazing experience all round. But unfortunately, it was cut a bit short by the COVID crisis.
So what happened?
Well, so I was there. It basically took almost 12 months to get through all the training hurdles in the system to get checked to line. But I'd established myself there, had a little flat, and I'd finished my training, finally got through all the hurdles. I was checked to line for only 2 weeks as a full captain over there, and then the airline stood us all down because of the COVID. So I had to come home, having kind of had done the hard yards, but not achieving that financial reward that I had gone up there for in the first place. But I must say that the airline was very commendable the way they dealt with it all. They, the circumstances were completely outside of their control, and they looked after us as best they could. Until the point that it became sort of untenable. So I've still got a Chinese license, and I guess the door would still be open to going back up there if I can sort of get through the medical and those sim checks again. But who knows what will happen in the meantime.
What's the future of aviation then because of COVID?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting one, Mark, and one that I guess nobody really can guess at the moment. We've never seen anything like this with the aeroplane. I mean, we've had SARS and 9/11 and other big setbacks before, but this is to use a far too often used term, completely unprecedented at the moment. And I fear that even if aviation is able to recover, even if the industry, if someone can click their fingers and say, righto, you can jump in your airplanes and go flying again. I think the problem with this current crisis is it may have, it's going to change people's travel habits quite significantly. So we've not only got to get the aeroplanes flying again, we've got to get people flying again, and that's going to take some time. I don't really know how it's going to play out. I can only be hopeful that it will get back to the way it was. This is my beloved industry, and the thing that gives me some confidence in that, Mark, is the fact that I think there's still that unerring instinct in people to travel and move and explore. At least I hope that that's still there in people.
Well, let's just hope. But it has been an absolute pleasure to spend some time over the bonnet. Captain Paul McKeown, thanks for joining us.
Captain Mark Piepers, thanks for having me.